Hi, and welcome to Rule of Carnage. This is where myself, Glenn Ford, a games designer and developer, talks to this guy, Mike Hutchinson, also games designer and developer, about designing better miniatures games. Now, the last couple of conversations we had that just went up, we're talking about player personality types, specifically in relation to how people approach the rules of the game and the army building the game and the actual playing of the game. But interestingly, Mike popped up on a podcast I was listening to the other day where he said something that I thought was quite interesting, is that the sorts of games that these minis games, have a bizarrely high level of prep level before somebody is allowed to engage with the game. And it's something that comes up sort of constantly, that this is a hobby and a game, that it has these two sort of separate but really deeply intrinsically linked parts that genuinely pull it out as unusual to sort of almost everything else. It's just before we came on to record, I was talking to Mike about, I remember the old days, I had a ZX Spectrum as a young man, and you would get books of games that were just code you had to type in before you were allowed to play the game, thick books of code. And this was an entirely appropriate way, and this is in an era where you'd get a manual that was 40 pages before you were expected to sort of be allowed to play a game. And obviously
and this would be like today if you were sitting down to play Call of Duty and the game was there but you weren't allowed to play it until you learned to program your own player character. That's essentially what we're dealing with here when it comes to miniature war games, where they say, look, there's a load of fun contained here, but you can't have it until you learn how to do an entire hobby, sticking things together and building things and painting them and building the terrain to go around it. And no, I'm not going to tell you what this is going to look like. You're going to have to research it and figure it out and watch other people. And yeah,
absolutely.
Obviously, for people like you and me who grew up doing it, there must have been a time where it didn't make sense. And of course, this is what the Games Workshop hobby stores, their retail presence, is so excellent at. They provide this sort of physical example of it and then a bunch of people who you can talk to. But I don't know that we really remember what it was like to be, the time before we knew that you could turn egg boxes upside down and paint them grey.
Absolutely. And I think it's super interesting, how many people of our generation you talk to about their path into the hobby. And it was things like Hero Quest, Space Crusade, Space Hulk, which were board games with a bunch of minis in. And personally, it was okay, well, I've got this bunch of Gene Stealers. What else can I do with them? Oh, there's this game system where you can put them down and play with them on the table. So I think it'd be interesting to talk a little bit about maybe some archetypes of how people approach the hobby, and maybe how that means those people might approach your game, and try and talk about ways you can sort of connect those two things together. And obviously this would be much more sort of anecdotal than the previous conversation, because as far as I'm aware, this isn't something that's been given sort of open study, but it's 30 odd years for each of us of anecdotal evidence, so it might have some weight to it. I thought what might be fun in a way to sort of, before talking about some more of the archetypes, is to go into a little bit of self-analysis on the way that we approach the hobby. And I think specifically because for me, for people who don't know, I feel like me and Mike have really weirdly different ways of approaching the hobby side of the game. So, for example, as sort of a bit of sort of self-introduction, I don't like particularly painting minis. I have never bought a mini that I didn't have a plan for as to what game I would put it into on the tabletop in my life, ever. Never parted with
minis are a functional object for you.
They are absolutely a functional object. I want to paint them sufficiently to be allowed to play with them and have no further interest in it than that.
But at the same time, you will paint them.
Absolutely, yes. That's a marcus. That's a self-respect thing. You paint that, you paint it. But also, it's for me, it's sort of that thing of maybe it's getting the money's worth out of it. It's the number of times I see people who have paid, I know, hundreds of pounds for an army, and then don't engage with it to paint it. It's almost like you're sort of leaving money on the table. But equally, as Mike has pointed out once or twice, I heavily convert every army I have. I put unnecessary and excessive amounts of time into modding my armies. You would think that, given my attitude, I'd glue them together, stick them on a base, basic paint job and move on. But I don't. I model, I convert, I create backgrounds, and I create stories from them. And sometimes I'm not really sure why I have those drives going on. They seem very sort of counter to each.
Can I provide an outside perspective then?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
You get in the last couple of conversations where we were talking about the Magic the Gathering player personas. We talked about the sort of persona that you are, which is a player that wants to use the engagement with the game as a form of self-expression and to sort of say, hey, I have a unique path that's different to other people's path through the rules thicket to victory. And I sort of perceive your converting of the army as another flavor of that, which is, it's not like a victory so much, but like there definitely is tiers of how good your hobby is. And to get to a really high level of hobby, you both want a very well painted and thematic army, but for extra points, it's like a unique theme, and the models support that theme, and that theme is something that you like. I think one of the things that like interacts really nicely is you come up with a unique way to victory from a rules perspective, and then you find a rationale in the story to model the army. So I think it's another reflection of that player persona type, where it's like, well, I'm going to be uniquely awesome at this where no one else has done it. I'm not going to see an amazing conversion and go, oh, that's cool, I will also do that conversion, because then my conversion will be cool.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I do. I think, and thinking about this, I think it's like that seems to be like how deeply ingrained into that sort of Johnny mindset that I am, that it's like, okay, I want to do an Empire army that only has engineer characters. Why on earth would such an army exist? That's a very bizarre thing. Okay, maybe they're this and they've been like caught weirdly out in the open. So that means that my spearmen have to be like all converted up pistoliers that are grouped round in a last stand, because they're not spearmen. Because if I had proper spearmen, my army wouldn't only have engineer characters in it. This explains it, and now I have to go on this whole journey. And then equally, I think sometimes I find it quite interesting that you're very miniatures driven, I think, as a hobbyist. But you were saying the other day that you very rarely convert or like kit bash or sort of tinker with the miniature, that you very often sort of get it and have it sort of as it was intended.
I think I run a very broad spectrum, like, because sometimes, so for example, you won't be able to see it super well, but like this is a you can't see his face because I painted it green. This is a Gazgrel Thraka like stand-in model. It's completely scratch built from a Age of Sigmar like Auric sort of big boss, and it's got like an entire sculpted tank base, and these are like scratch like I will do heavy conversion work, but at the same time I will quite happily stick together a bunch of line troops exactly as the box describes. And it's because I think sometimes like enjoying a model kit in the way that, you know, I used to with an Airfix kit, where there is just a joy in a sort of perfection of approaching the kit as the kit is, putting the kit together at a high level of sort of skill and finish. Like that has its own pleasure. And for me, kit bashing is almost like a different hobby. And sometimes an army will say to me, you must kit bash this. This must be a very intricate thing. And sometimes, so like I'm building a warband for a sort of Inquisitor 28 thing. And obviously each model is painstakingly, you know, sculpted up from the ground by sticking bits of my fingers together. But I've got some Space Marines over there and I'm just building them exactly as they look on the box, because whatever, like it's, you know, there's a pleasure in that. But I guess the other thing is that I have a slightly weird respect for particularly metal and sort of boutique miniatures, where if I've got an old miniature, like our friend Rufus gave me some metal Rogue Trader orcs this week, like I'm not going to mess with those. I'm just going to enjoy them as they are, and then maybe at some point they will leave my possession and they will be, you know, artifacts for other people. Or equally, if I've acquired a lovely resin miniature from somewhere, I kind of want to enjoy what the creator gave me.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting thing for myself that I haven't like fudged around with my Malifaux minis, because what's the point? Malifaux, like in first edition, didn't let you like give options to the
Right.
models, so they were exactly what the profile would represent. Also, I think you sometimes you don't necessarily. So I'm of the opinion that
That's so weird, because I had too many Malifaux models and I didn't really like the plastic ones. So many of my plastic Malifaux models got cut up and reassembled because I started making all kinds of proxy models. And so like it's weird, even within our mismatched approaches, we've swapped over for one particular range of miniatures for some reason.
yeah,
And presumably it's because like the game doesn't permit it. But on my side, I don't give a hoot whether the game permits it or not. I'm like, these models would look amazing if they had ruffs and bigger hats. And
yeah, and so I think figuring out what is driving your players at that point, and it's like I I have to get an army finished. It has to be started, it has to be finished. It's the whole story. You know, you don't have the
I've
obsessive,
never finished an army.
you don't have the obsessive mindset of going like, you know, the idea of getting to the end of an army and then like being 2 or 3 units left and just going, yeah, I think it's time to move on to the next thing. It's just like, that's that's insane. Just finish it. Like, you know, get closure on that thing.
Yeah, I've never finished anything. I have a couple of like 1,000 point armies that are fully painted, but like they're not a finished army because there's another 1,000 points that I have, you know, in various states of construction or primed or whatever. So I just have a series of projects that I rotate through as my whim changes.
Mm.
And I don't give a flying hoot if any of them ever get finished.
So sort of maybe to sort of move on to what might be some of the sort of archetypes of like the way people engage with the hobby part of the game, and in relation to not finishing. And I want to try and track these into what you can do with rule sets and design to sort of encourage these people. But you know, there are a couple that feel a bit sort of like I don't understand this approach to it, and I'll just drop one of those in.
Well, so just before you enter that section, so I think maybe for this conversation we'll kind of maybe constrain ourselves. We'll leave maybe terrain and board building on the table, and maybe we can come back to that in a second conversation, because I feel like that's equally important, the DIY nature of the play area, but maybe we can cover that in a separate conversation.
Well, this is the thing. I think also I think there are interesting. So a couple of the sort of ideas of archetypes I think of are that there are people who are more, as much if not more, interested in the sort of the table construction and the terrain construction than the minis construction. I think there is the sort of the host type, you know, who wants to have their table and bring people to their table, and wants that table to sort of be particularly impressive. They're the rare sort of person who will paint up NPCs for a scenario, rather than just using like bases and minis and models.
And I think further, they are the player, because I'm this player as well, who not only will provide a lovely set of terrain as a host, but will also probably buy 2 armies for every game.
And I think since we're sort of started to talk about this, I think that the host is a good example of a player type that can really be encouraged by a set of rules, because the sort of person who is interested in building terrain and interested in building a tabletop, I think, is obviously going to be quite interested in games that interact with that terrain and interact with the tabletop, and suggest to them it's a good idea to have different sorts of pools or different sorts of forests, and elevation is like super. I often think that one of the quickest shorthands for telling if a rule set is a narrative rule set is whether it has rules for climbing, jumping, and falling.
Right.
As soon as you see that a rule set has those sort of 3 rules, it's like, okay, this is doing something more narrative. Whereas if a rule set doesn't have that in, it's a bit more sort of meant to be strategic or crunchy.
I think this player type, because I approached second edition Malifaux in this way, and I've seen some people in the Hobgoblin Discord approaching Hobgoblin's Chaos of War tables in the same way. Like, the behavior is you read the rules, you get excited about playing the game, And then you get a piece of paper and you write down all of the different like terrain types or objective types or like special counters that you're going to need. And so I went through and I went like, okay, so I'm going to need like an occult book token and I will sculpt something there. And I'm going to need like a place for indoors and a place for outside. And so I've seen people in the Hobgoblin Discord go through my Chaos of War tables, which are the like D66 tables that allow you to sort of procedurally generate a fantasy fun time. And they will go and they'll go, okay, so I'm going to need 6 columns of rock and 2 bridges to go over a chasm. And I'm going to need a chasm. And they'll like itemize all these things because in order to be the perfect host, but also to like squeeze the maximum amount of hobby juice out of this rule system, you're like, oh, great, you've given me a whole set of tasks to do, activities to engage with. And so I think providing a very generic terrain system from a rules perspective can be improved upon, can provide more utility if it's then like backed up with some level of specificity about what it is that you will need to play the game. And the players that don't care will just ignore it and they will just substitute in a plastic circle like a blank base or something, and they won't care.
Yeah, no, 100%. I have sets of mini bases with numbers written on them in gold Sharpie for when I meant to put down objective tokens. Or...
I mean, you've played games where there's lots of walls because it's like an internal thing, and you'll just use like strips of paper, flat paper, or even just draw on a whiteboard.
Yeah, no,
I can't do that. It doesn't make any sense to my brain.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I have rolls of wallpaper for spreading across the table and drawing terrain onto, because yeah, that's the thing that interests me in engagement game. So I do think this is one of the things where it's like you can go over the top, but you can go a long way before you go over the top. You're not going to put off the players who don't care. Certainly sort of to a reasonable degree.
So I wonder if there's a sort of 2x2 here, because I do wonder if we're maybe conflating 2 axes here. One is I care a lot about the one is I want to be a good host and provide a fantastic place to play the game and a way of sharing the game experience. But the other is this interest in the miniature reality. I'm not sure exactly how to describe it, but like as a kid, like the beginnings of my journey into this hobby were like, I was fundamentally fascinated by the miniaturization of reality and fantasy, and like the fact that you can build little pieces of terrain and they can have details on them. And like, that is just lovely and interesting. And I think there are people who will go very, very high up on that spectrum. In our Rule of Carnage Discord, someone was sharing their phenomenal Necromunda sort of Inquisitor terrain where he's very carefully built lots of modular pieces, and not only do they fit together in a very functional way, but like if you zoom in, the whole thing is as detailed as a video game like level is. It's got all these little moments, and like you zoom into a corner, you're like, oh, that totally makes sense. Like all of these pieces have been arranged in a way that makes sense on a miniature way. Like I know I can almost see the scholar that works in this corner, or I can see the mechanic that has left this pipe unfixed, and it's just, you know, that level of detail is well up there. But I don't think that person has to be doing it to be a host. They could be doing it because they're just purely obsessed with the craft. And so I think, you know, we all want to know someone in that upper right hand corner who both really wants to provide the perfect host and will spend hours making a perfect.
Yeah, and I think before we sort of move on from this section of the conversation, I think probably you've got some sort of scatter plot somewhere where the indices of this are something along the lines of, there's a sort of completionist approach, which is the game says I need these things to play the game properly. I want a checklist, and I'll go down and make sure that I've got them so that I can achieve all the rules moments. There's the sort of the table modeler who wants inspiration to build a particularly beautiful table and then would like it to pay out ideally within the rules, but like hitting their inspiration points is probably the most important thing. There's the thing we talked about in the last conversation, you touched on in the last conversation, which is the sort of the cinematographer who wants a rule set that offers them the chance for like cool cinematic moments. I want to be able to wall run up to that balcony, jump onto it, and then swan dive off to do something spectacular, because I want those to be sort of those cinematic moments. And the more sort of the social end of that aspect, the person who wants to build a tabletop and say, I have the bespoke tabletop, come to me, let's enjoy this thing I did together.
Mhm.
And I think the people who approach the terrain end of the modeling, probably are somewhere around on that scatter diagram, pulled in one another direction. But those are all things you can hit with your rule set for people. You can give them that checklist of, these are technically the things you require. This is your shopping list. Enjoy acquiring the shopping list. These are the inspirational images I'm going to give you about it. Here's a temple of like the blind god. This is what it looks like. Here are the cinematic moments of how you interact with that terrain. And here is the idealized tabletop that you can offer people and bring them in and socialize with them.
So to make that concrete, what I've done in Hobgoblin is three things. One is I've provided a set of general terrain traits, keywords, where I'm trying to make as much as possible, and go back and find the episode where Glenn rants about rough terrain for more detail on this. But like, provide a set of rules where interacting with the terrain is worth your time and is a net positive experience. So it's worth having terrain on the table because it's not just slowing you down or making things irritating. The second thing is I then immediately provided a table of examples where it's like, okay, so if you had a mystical ruin, it would have these terrain traits. If you had like a fungal grove, a mushroom grove, it would have these traits. And so by providing 12 or 15 of those, I sort of give you the beginnings of your shopping list for what you're going to need. And then I go further in the D66 Chaos of War tables where I say, oh, well, at the beginning of the game, you might choose to roll a dice and it will tell you that you must have 6 columns of rock. So you better have 6 columns of rock or you're going to have to re-roll. So I think those are ways that you can build that sort of build up to that.
Yeah, so I think those are some sort of neat ideas of maybe the ways that sort of more terrain or table driven hobbyists might approach your game. We'll sort of wrap up this conversation for the moment. I'll hopefully drop in a link to that conversation where I have a little rant about rough terrain into the links. If you go down there to the comment section and link section, drop in a comment for us. How do you approach terrain? What excites you about seeing terrain rules or terrain descriptions in a rule set? Do you think you fit a sort of archetype of a terrain modeler, of a terrain hobbyist? Do you just run from all-terrain modeling, as fast as you can, and would rather put down books and Jenga blocks when you're playing? While you're in there dropping those comments down, please thump on the like and subscribe button. Swing over to Discord. There are, as Mike has just mentioned, some lovely pictures of some amazing terrain in the Rule of Carnage Discord that may inspire you even more than the rule set you're engaging with.
It inspired me.
And we'll have a little chat about miniatures modeling personality types in the next conversation. But that's the next conversation. And for now, I think we'll sign off and we'll say thank you and goodbye. So bye-bye, bye-bye, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.